This segment focuses on Chapter 9, the Keynesian model in action. What we're specifically doing is taking a look at what we refer to as aggregate expenditures. Remember when we calculated the gross domestic product, the GDP, through the expenditure approach, we totaled up total spending by consumers, by businesses, and investment in capital equipment and productive capacities, government spending, and net exports. So if we total all of those up, we get aggregate expenditures. And in the previous chapter, Chapter 8, we focused on the consumption function and the business investment function as well. We're going to shift gears here a little bit and focus not only on aggregate expenditures, but also on total output. So we are going to really be kind of splitting hairs here, looking at total output versus total consumption. The best way to do that is to look at a table found in your book. You'll find that, I believe, on page 224 of this edition, but I have a copy of it right here for you as well. And what we're doing here is we are looking at each one of those functions of spending that make up our gross domestic product. We are going to compare it to output and go from there. A couple of things I want to say first. There are so many columns on here, and you know what? You know all this stuff already. Let's just go through and identify what each of those columns are. Okay, the first column is Y. Think of this as output. Total output produced. The next column is C, as you know, that stands for consumption function. I, business investment. G, government spending. X, net exports. The next column is AE, that's aggregate expenditures. Aggregate means total. If we take C plus I plus G plus X, we get aggregate expenditures. So what I've done is I have just taken the table that I had and folded it in order to eliminate a couple of those columns so that when we analyze, because what we're really going to be doing is comparing output to aggregate expenditures and identifying the impact that has on inventory. Is it being depleted or accumulated? And then what impact is that going to have on the gross domestic product and employment? So the point of showing you this folded model is that the two main columns we're going to be taking a look at are column 1, which is our output, and column 6, which is our aggregate expenditures. Okay, so let's just focus on those columns, or the columns between 1 and 6 for a couple minutes, and then we'll look at 7 and 8 just briefly, okay? Now in this first row, we have output being 0, okay? Just nothing is there. And yet, we still see some consumer spending, that's 0.6. We see business investment, that's 1. We see government expenditures, that's 1. And net exports is a minus 0.1. Now remember, for the United States, X is going to have a negative value because we have a trade deficit. We are importing more from foreigners than we are exporting out to foreigners. So that's going to be negative. When we total this up, we get 2.5 as far as aggregate expenditures. 0.6 plus 1 is 1.6, plus 1 is 2.6, minus 0.1 gives us 2.5. Okay? So again, in just a bit, we're going to be comparing this 2.5 in aggregate expenditures to the output. Let's look at another example here. We'll go down one more row. And here we have consumption is 1.1. Now notice there's been an increase in consumption. However, investment spending has stayed the same, that's still 1. Government spending has stayed the same, that's still 1. And net exports has stayed the same at minus 0.1 as well. Now the reasons why I, G, and X have stayed the same, even though we've seen an increase in output and income, is because this is an example of autonomous spending. Autonomous spending, remember, is spending that's not dependent on some other variable such as income. Now, with consumer spending, you remember from the previous chapter that there certainly was some autonomous consumption or autonomous spending. That was like automatic spending that was going to happen whether we were making any money or $1 bazillion of income. That autonomous consumption or autonomous spending is found by identifying how much consumption or how much spending is occurring when income is 0. Here, income is 0. It does not exist, yet we still see 0.6 in consumer spending. That is that automatic or autonomous consumption. It's the spending that happens basically for necessities, food, water, shelter, etc. Now, again, we had I was 1.0, G was 1.0, X was negative 0.1, and those stayed the same. The reason why those stayed the same as our output increased is that for business investment, government spending, and net exports, these all are autonomous. They are not dependent on what's going on with output. I mean, really, when you take a look at business investment, it's not going to increase as output increases directly. It's generally dependent on what happens in the boardroom. What is the board of directors going to decide as far as capital expansion and increasing the productivity through, maybe new tooling or expansions or whatever. Government spending is not directly impacted by the level of output or income, but it is made up of decisions by our politicians. Congress will decide through budgets and political decisions how much government spending is going to occur. So that is autonomous as well. It's not dependent on the level of income. And then finally, X, that also is autonomous because that is not dependent on what's the level of income or output. It's dependent on really foreign policy, specifically foreign economic policy. So you're going to see as you go down this entire table that business investment, government spending, and X, they're constant all the way down, okay? The thing that changes is the consumption function, which really represents the majority of the GDP. In fact, if we took C plus I and added them together, that would equal about 83% of the entire aggregate expenditures. Let's go ahead and look at another level of income. We'll say it's 2. Consumption has now increased to 1.6, but again, investment spending by businesses, government spending, and net exports has remained the same. So we have 1.6 plus 1 is 2.6, plus 1 is 3.6, minus 0.1 gives us 3.5. And I think you can see what's going on there. In order to get this aggregate expenditure amount, what are we doing? We're just totaling up the total consumer spending, investment spending, government spending, and net exports. We'll just do one more here. Let's go to 4. When output income is 4, we see consumer spending increasing to 2.6, investment spending 1, 1, and minus 0.1 here. So 2.6, 3.6, 4.6, minus 0.1 gives us 4.5. Okay, so that's how we calculate everything in the aggregate expenditures model. In order to just streamline this a little bit, what I'm going to do is, like I said, I have folded this table to eliminate these just to make it a little cleaner to look at, okay? So the big thing that we're doing here, you guys, is we're looking at our income level and we're comparing it to aggregate expenditures. So income, output, same thing. Aggregate expenditures. This is how much is being produced. This is how much is being taken off the market by consumers, business, government, net exports. Now, if you take a look at this first one, how much is being produced? 0, nada, zip. Yet we do see some autonomous spending. Consumers, businesses, governments, net exports, that totals 2.5. So we have 0 units being produced, yet 2.5 being taken off the market. How are we preparing or how are we meeting that demand? Well, we're depleting our inventory. This column here deals with inventory. This is our inventory level, and it is being depleted by negative 2.5 here. So in order to meet the demands, the expenditure demands by C plus I plus G plus X, we need to yank 2.5 out of inventory. So inventory is being depleted. Let's go down again. We'll look at that column 8 in just a bit. Now here we have another level of output, and that is 1.0. Aggregate expenditures, though, is 3.0. So we'll just call it a unit just for simplicity. 1 unit is being put out on the market as output. 3 of them are being demanded, though. Well, where are the remaining 2 going to come from? Because if we're only producing 1, but 3 are being demanded, we're going to be pulling 2 out of inventory. So again, inventory is being depleted. That's why there's the minus sign in front of it. Another level, we have 2 units being produced. 3.5, are being demanded. Total spending, aggregate expenditures equals 3.5 here. That means we will use the 2.0, plus we're going to pull another 1.5 out of inventory. So inventory, again, is being depleted. Let's continue on until we get to, well, let's skip down to 4. At this level, 4 units are being put out, or 4 trillion are being produced, but 4.5 trillion are being demanded. Again, output is not enough to meet the current demand, so what are we doing? We're going to withdraw from inventory. You can see that inventory is being depleted. That's generally a good sign for the economy because it means that total spending is increasing, and in order to meet the demand, producers are going to have to hire more people so they can produce more stuff so they can meet that demand. That's why over here in this very last column 8, you see direction of the real gross domestic product and employment. You can see that when output is less than total expenditures, inventory is being depleted. For example, output is 4, 4.5 are being demanded, so we are withdrawing from inventory. We're yanking stuff out of inventory to meet the demand. What is that going to do? That's going to encourage producers to hire more people, maybe pay some overtime, add another shift. That means we're going to see an increase in goods and services produced, and also an increase in employment. In other words, our unemployment will be decreasing. Let's go down to the next one, and here we have a situation called equilibrium. 5 units are being produced, 5 are being taken off the market, or we could say $5 trillion worth of goods and services are being produced, $5 trillion worth of goods and services are being demanded. So we have an equilibrium situation. There's really no incentive at this point to lay people off, and there's certainly no incentive to hire more people. This is referred to as equilibrium. Now, equilibrium doesn't necessarily mean ideal, because we're going to see that sometimes we can be at equilibrium and still have high levels of unemployment. And here's where John Maynard Keynes' theories really are supported. Let's take a look at levels of output that exceed aggregate expenditures. We have income output at 6, but only 5.5 are being demanded. Aggregate expenditures is actually less than output that's being produced. So we see inventory is being accumulated. So we have inventory accumulation. The next one, 7 units are being produced, but only 6 are being taken off the market. So we have 1 unit that's going into inventory. Now here's where producers are saying, you know, I keep producing more, but customers aren't buying. So the warehouse is getting full. What are we going to do? Are we going to keep producing at that same rate? No. Maybe we're going to scale back. Maybe we're going to take some of the people that we had hired and lay them off. We're going to see unemployment increase as a result of this. In other words, we'll see employment go down. We'll also see production go down. So the total value of all goods and services being produced is going to decrease because we are accumulating inventory. Think about what happens even if you work at a concession stand or something, or like when I used to work, well, I've worked at Burger King and Hardee's as a student. So if we were producing French fries, like a bus pulls in or something, we drop fries, we get them ready, and you know what? Maybe that bus only had 2 people on it. Well, the output was much greater than the demand, so what did we do? We did not drop any more fries, right? And sometimes when we were expecting a real busy day and sales were flat, what would we do? We'd send people home because we no longer needed them. That's really an example of how much labor was needed. The very last one we'll take a look at here, we have 8 units being produced, 6.5 are being demanded, again, aggregate expenditures. So we see inventory accumulating of 1.5, and again, that's going to lead to a declining gross domestic product and also decreasing employment. And remember, when we say decreasing employment, what are we saying? We're saying unemployment goes up. Let's just look at a few highlights with respect to the aggregate expenditure model that we've gone through. So what you might want to do is just refer to this table that we've gone through. It's also in your book. But when output is 0, there's still some spending that occurs. Aggregate expenditures is 2.5. That was considered autonomous. Now again, Y was 0. Right here, output was 0. It was non-existent. Yet we still had some spending that was occurring. That again is autonomous because it is the spending that occurs even when income and output is 0. When we have aggregate expenditures that are greater than output, we see a trend, okay? Because aggregate expenditures is greater than the aggregate output. Aggregate, again, means total. So C plus I plus G plus X equals AE. When that is greater than Y, the stuff being produced, businesses will increase production. Orders for raw materials and employment increase, taxes paid to governments go up, and again, unemployment goes down, more people have paychecks, they're spending money, that stimulates the economy. Notice that when aggregate expenditures is greater than output, inventory is being depleted, and that occurs until that output level is equal to aggregate expenditures. So let's take a look at when output is actually greater than aggregate expenditures, when that inventory accumulates. When output is greater than aggregate expenditures, and we saw that here we had equilibrium. 5 units were produced, 5 were demanded off the markets, we had equilibrium. So anytime our output was greater than 6, we saw that the output was greater than aggregate expenditures and inventory was actually accumulating. Producers are producing more than is actually being demanded or spent by buyers. That leads to producers scaling back operations. They're just not selling what they're producing, so they need to scale back. Employment declines. Orders for raw material go down. Taxes paid to the government go down. So why? Well, we see more resources not being used. So the trend, whenever output is greater than AE, the trend is we're going to see cutbacks and layoffs then. Now, there was a level that I mentioned called macro equilibrium, and that is when output was equal to 5 trillion. Total expenditures, C plus I plus G plus X, was exactly equal to the level of output. The economy is at equilibrium. And all that is produced is actually being purchased. Now, the thing you have to remember is this. Well, there are many things you have to remember. But take a look at this. If the government wasn't spending money, and we didn't have that export component, if it was just C and I, consumers and businesses spending, we would not be at that equilibrium point. So government spending is a big chunk of our economy. And here's where Keynes, John Maynard Keynes' point, is very well supported. Aggregate output, and therefore aggregate expenditures, is greatly impacted by governments. Now, real classical economists argued that if the government would just stay out of the picture, the economy would reach equilibrium. But we would not have seen equilibrium at 5.0 had it not been for the involvement of government spending. Equilibrium would not have been reached. Now, the big thing to keep in mind, too, is this. Macro equilibrium is not necessarily the same thing as full employment. If equilibrium is reached, there's no pressure or incentive to change levels of output. There's no incentive to increase output because spending is greater than output. There's no incentive to decrease output because output is greater than spending. We're just kind of stuck there. Now, the situation is this. The level of output needed to reach full employment might very well be higher than that macro equilibrium level. It might be that in order to reach equilibrium, in order to reach full employment, we have to, have our aggregate expenditures be greater than 5.0 if we were looking at that other table. According to Keynes, in order to increase output and therefore get people back to work so that aggregate expenditures increases and then there's that incentive to hire more people, the government should take action to, spend more money basically to get more people working. And I'll just illustrate with an example here. This is the same table we were taking a look at, and I'm just going to do a little changing, okay? I'm going to go to right at this level, okay? So when output is 6, consumer spending is 3.6, business investment is 1. We're going to say that instead of government spending being 1, we're going to crank that up to 2, okay? And we're going to keep this the same. net exports is going to stay the same at minus 0.1. Now adding these together, 3.6, 4.6, 6.6, minus 0.1, that gives us aggregate expenditures of 6.5. Now take a look at what's going on here. Output is 6. 6 units are being produced. 6.5 are being demanded. So what's happening here? Inventory is being depleted again. And when aggregate expenditures is greater than total output, there's an incentive to hire more people. So we are going to see employment increase. We're going to see orders for raw material increase. We're going to see greater output because the demand for goods and services have increased. We'll look at one more, and that is the next level. Again, output is 7. Consumer spending is 4.1. Investment spending is 1, so that's 5.1, 7.1, and then minus 0.1 here. And we get now, we're at equilibrium again. But you can see that this level of equilibrium happens as a result of an increase in government spending. We increase government spending from 1 to 2 in order to increase the demand for goods and services, which encourage producers to hire more people until we hit that equilibrium point. So again, the point is this. As Keynes said, government spending is very important or very significant to the economy. In order to fix the economy, he argued that governments may need to increase their expenditures in order to pump money into the economy. And some of the examples we've seen of that, you can look around this area. And I know many of you are online. I've had students all over the United States. But there are all sorts of projects that, like out of the New Deal, FDR did like Wyalusing State Park and Cronchage Park and Boscoville. Those were projects increasing government spending to get people to work. When they got back to work, what could they do? Well, they could increase their consumer spending, which was a big part of driving up aggregate expenditures, which encouraged more employment. So that ends this segment, just discussing the aggregate expenditures model.